Massively multiplayer online role-playing games. A genre that I love just on principle, even if I'm not nearly as deep into them as many players are. Unless you count PSO, which I really don't. But they've been on my mind a bit lately. First I started playing Old School Runescape earlier this year, and I've done most of the free-to-play content and have generally fallen in love with it, mostly because it's not like other modern RPGs. And then Guild Wars 3 got announced at Summer Games Fest, which was quite a surprise actually. When I first started working on an idea for this script, I was actually going to muse that it seemed unlikely we'd see a new big budget MMO anytime soon, especially after some of the most recent big attempts ultimately failed. I just figured the way that games are developed and viewed these days was just too hostile to the genre. I mean, maybe my previous assumption could be right and Guild Wars 3 has an uphill battle, but hey, let's hold out hope. Yeah, Guild Wars 2 was part of the last big wave of exciting new MMOs, and honestly it was more successful than its major contemporaries of Star Wars The Old Republic and Terra Online. It would be nice if we had a new era of innovation in MMOs kicked off by Guild Wars 3, but let's take this opportunity to throw my hat into the ring of speculating why MMOs just don't do as well as they used to, because that's definitely not a subject that has been done to death or anything. A big issue that I think has kind of degraded MMOs is a gradual shift towards being more systems-focused in their design rather than world-focused. I mean, perhaps it is inevitable. MMOs are a genre that tend to attract a central, hardcore player base while being harder for new players to get into. But I do think focusing exclusively on this hardcore player base leads to MMOs becoming less massive. Not to mention, I feel like MMOs, on their very principle, are a genre that can least afford to become as insular as they have. MMOs need players, and as the MMO player base has fractured among different games, it's harder and harder to keep a sustainable player base. The biggest way in which I think this often manifests is that the journey and the leveling experience are greatly devalued. Partly I think this is the result of a poorly handled attempt to solve the fact that MMOs are, or were, very grindy. Before these games zeroed in on the end game as the thing that keeps players hooked, a long journey was there, often just keep players playing the game. But as things changed, the end game became more important, and these sorts of grindy progression systems began to be more and more criticized. The journey to the end game was handled very strangely. The leveling experiences of MMOs are often simultaneously treated as being unimportant, something that both the devs and high-level players view as something that should be sped through with little thought, but also something that can't be removed from the genre, that it would somehow degrade the games artistically, or simply because the hardcore player base likes having some sort of necessary suffering to differentiate themselves from those who did not wish to go through it. The end result of this is a tendency towards progression experiences that serve no one. These are experiences that are long enough that you can't just get to the good stuff without spending a few dozen hours unless you already know what to do, but they're so devoid of friction that it is neither engaging nor actually prepares you as a player for when the challenge kicks in. These tend to be just long, repetitive series of tasks to make your number go up. Genuinely, experiences like these are probably the biggest reason I'm not more into MMOs. These are often very vapid and transient experiences. Experiences where nothing you gained actually had long-term value except as a stepping stone to the end game. Of course, the focus on endgame is a whole other topic. I will do a video on that someday. It does tie into the changes to many series that I love, but I will say that while I'm not a fan, I do understand it as a necessary evil, mostly for reasons relating to making sure players have other players to play with. Plus, there's also just a loss of freedom and more focus on systems due to the ways in which all live service games attempt to get their hooks into players, rather than being a world full of possibilities where you can pursue whatever you want. There's a focus on repetitive daily tasks. One very noticeable and extreme example of this shift from world focus to systems focus is probably PSO2 New Genesis. One of its big selling points, in fact, the main reason they gave to play this over base PSO2, was its open world. And while I could argue about the execution, when I returned to it last year, there was very little reason to spend time exploring the open world, and it hadn't been added to in like over 2 years. And I could talk about other aspects of design, but that's the main one, although there is a particular example of wasted potential. MMOs are probably one of the last genres that were really improved by technological progress. If you've been around for a while, you'll remember that it wasn't really until sometime in the 2010s that internet speeds generally became good enough that they're no longer a massive limiting factor for designing online games. It feels like there should be some untapped design potential there, but the golden age of MMOs had already passed. In the end, the choice to de-emphasize the world in favor of systems is unorthodox. It's not as though there's no demand for systems-heavy games. I mean, I do love a complex systems-focused RPG myself, but it once again feels like it's losing the dream of the MMO, the massive part. If the game mostly becomes focused around people living in hub areas, running the same content in instances, that's not really any more massive than lobby-based online RPGs like Phantasy Star Online or Monster Hunter. The only real difference is that maybe you have more players in the lobby and maybe some raids with higher player counts. But the dream of an MMO, of a living world to explore, is so often left by the wayside. I think the biggest issue MMOs face, though, isn't anything they can really control. I think when nostalgia's involved, there's a bad tendency to focus on wanting to recreate every last little particular of the systems, while forgetting the aspects that you just can't recreate, the context the game releases into. Because I think the biggest problem with MMOs is that they're just not special anymore, and it really isn't their fault. If you're like in your 30s or older, old enough to remember the golden age of MMOs, I want you to think about what games were like 20, 25 years ago, and what was the general culture and the world like. And you'll probably start seeing my point immediately. For one, open world games as we think of them today, heavily influenced by Ubisoft's games of the 7th console generation, hadn't manifested. There were still some open world games, such as Morrowind and other early Elder Scrolls titles, but these were particularly ambitious. The open world hadn't really migrated into its own thing yet. Games of the era were often more focused, which I usually do like, admittedly. Didn't have games cramming in open worlds or RPG elements just because they're popular or the modern thing to do. In fact, it is kind of interesting how MMOs of the time were an outgrowth of RPGs. There's a good reason that MMO is usually seen as short for MMORPG. You could have a massively multiplayer online game of other genres, but you usually don't. This is the part where you point out your favorite massively multiplayer online game that isn't an RPG in the comments to drive engagement. But after the early MMOs took form, also drawing from even earlier online games that often had a particular focus on being a digital virtual world, MMOs largely became their own thing, largely divorcing themselves from the single-player RPGs that inspired them, and not really attempting to keep up with changing tastes in RPGs, which themselves changed a lot over the first quarter of the 21st century. And it's not just the open world. Early MMOs were online games in an era where the internet was new, exciting, and still kind of niche and nerdy. As I described in a previous video, the internet of the aughts was a place you escape to, not something you want to escape from. Most of the heavy-hitting MMOs came out in this era before social media, where forums were still the dominant way to interact with other people online. Online communities were smaller back then. This wasn't an era where you could scroll Twitter or chat on Discord on your phone. Going online meant sitting down at a computer, and most likely a desktop, not even a laptop you can bring with you. So MMOs and their multiplayer elements were an exciting new world. This was seen as something new and desirable, well before the perpetually online world that people have been growing to resent. Back when your first time playing an online game was something unique and special, not an expected part of all the most popular games that everyone plays. So in the end, MMOs are just not that special these days, when open world and online multiplayer are both so normalized these days that they're no longer impressive. In fact, both of these have intruded into games in ways that many players resent. Plus, there's also just more competition, both for players and for development resources. While MMOs aren't as prominent as they were in the aughts, there's the unfortunate trend that a lot of other games, so-called live service games, have muscled in on their turf. From a corporate perspective, it's easy to see why a lot of live service games get made. You get the captive audience and the potential for theoretically infinite earnings you'd get from an MMO, but you don't need to have the ambition or the budget of an MMO. And this means a lot more games competing for a finite pool of players. With the increased emphasis on daily quests and microtransactions, these games are competing directly with MMOs for players' time and money, so I can't imagine we'll get too many MMOs from big companies anymore when they can make a smaller game but make the same sort of money. And for players already hooked on a live service title that demands they put a bunch of time into dailies every day, they're less likely to have room in their lives for another time-consuming game. And lastly, the industry has just gotten more expensive and demanding, and I don't think in a good way. Regular single-player games are taking longer and costing more to make, and MMOs were already games that tended to have long, costly development cycles. At the same time, ambition, something that the MMOs of old had in spades, has become less and less prominent within the industry as the way to make games becomes more set in stone, and there's less and less that hasn't been done before. The MMOs of old are in an odd place, especially with the modern discourse's complicated relationship with nostalgia. Sometimes, like with Old School Runescape or Final Fantasy XI, there's a good reason the games are still beloved. They hold true to aspects of design that are compelling to players that other games had forgotten. Sometimes games streamline out some key part of themselves or just lose their way with design, as you can see with the fondness for older editions of World of Warcraft. But with MMOs, more than most other genres, the world has shifted around them in such a way that games that were once special no longer are. Plus, there's the ever-increasing pressure to speed up and streamline games these days. MMOs already do tend to suffer when you try and streamline them, and the pressure is only increasing. PSO2 New Genesis's movement systems come to mind as an example of less than ideal streamlining. Mostly because the teaser trailer we got makes me worry Guild Wars 3 will be trying something similar. While PSO2 really wants to be Breath of the Wild with its focus on freely exploring its open world and its use of suspiciously shrine-like training areas, it misses that Breath of the Wild doesn't give you total freedom without friction. Yes, Breath of the Wild lets you navigate pretty much anywhere, but its movement systems had friction to them. If there was some place hard to get to that you wanted to go, you had to earn it, either by finding a solution or just by demonstrating mechanical mastery. But PSO2's movement systems let you just sprint infinitely, double jump, wall jump, glide infinitely, and as a result it's quite easy to get anywhere you could see. The result, especially when combined with a world not nearly as dense with interesting things to find or handcrafted areas as Breath of the Wild is, MMOs is a world you will just mostly skip over, at least until you reach the end game and only venture out into the open world to do dailies, and otherwise will mostly stay in the hub areas and run instance content. Maybe a truly visionary game can breathe some life back into MMOs, but it will have a difficult time doing so, and I'm not even sure one big game can do it. I feel like there really needs to be a whole wave of new games. For an MMO to be exceptional, it needs to have an answer to the question of what makes this special. Whether they look to the past or the future, it is much harder in this era where online gaming is just the norm. But it's the only way for MMOs to be as special as they once were and to distinguish themselves from the vast array of live service games competing for players' time. And now back over to you. What's something you think is overlooked regarding what made the MMOs of old special, and what do you think a new MMO needs in order to stand out? But for now, this is Mikhail signing off.